So hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson, and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader and a former editor at the Gannon Knight. I mentioned the Gannon Knight because joining me in conversation is Mr. Frank Garland, who as the advisor to the student-produced, student-run newspaper on the campus of Gannon University has taught, guided, and shaped many young journalists over the years as they first cut their teeth in the industry. Frank, I say this on behalf of your former students, as I was once one, as well as your current pupils. Thank you for helping us learn to report the facts and tell stories with integrity and purpose, helping us to find our voices along the way. We are grateful. As an assistant professor and the Journalism Communications Program Director at Gannon University, Mr. Garland has taught there for over a decade, which will tell you that the usage of over, meaning more than, has been acceptable according to AP Style Guide for several years now, much to the chagrin of many traditionalists. Prior to coming to Gannon, Mr. Garland worked for 30 years as a news, features, and sports reporter at several Northern California newspapers, including the Modesto Bee and the Stockton Record. Raised in Pittsburgh, Mr. Garland is a lifelong Pirates fan who spent 7 summers researching and writing the definitive biography of Pirates Hall of Famer Willie Stargell, titled Willie Stargell, A Life in Baseball. He just recently completed his latest biography, which examines the life of another Pirate great, Arky Vaughan. Here we'll discuss the stories of both Stargell and Vaughan, what drew Garland to sports to begin with, and what America's pastime looks like amidst a pandemic. Since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comments section below. If you happen to be watching a later broadcast of this event, please do send us still your questions, and we'll do our best to get them to Mr. Garland. And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson educational programming and publication, as well as past events, past publications, please visit jeserie.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Mr. Frank Garland, thank you for joining me for this discussion.
My pleasure.
So I love the headset. It's like we're calling a baseball game, and I want to start at the beginning of baseball for you. So for me, Frank, it was a near rainout game. I can remember it. I was probably in about the 3rd grade. My dad had taken me to see the San Francisco Giants play the Pittsburgh Pirates, and it was right after Barry Bonds had left the Pirates, the Steel City, for San Fran. Most people had cleared out of the stands, and so we sneaked our way down closer to the dugout, and I got a chance to wave at Barry Bonds as he was trotting in from the outfield, and I swear when he waved, he was waving back to me. That was the moment for me that I felt connected to the sport of baseball. What was it for you?
For me, my earliest baseball memory was attending a game at Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. I probably was maybe 6 or 7, and I remember nothing about the game. All I remember is sitting there was a bleacher section down the left field line at Forbes Field. It was uncovered. And I remember sitting there with a couple of uncles and my brother eating meatball sandwiches. So that was, to me, I'm Italian, and meatballs and spaghetti are the staff of life. So I remember sitting there having a meatball sandwich and looking out on this green field and ballpark. And I think that's kind of where I got my first glimpse of love of baseball.
And so how did you turn that love of baseball and maybe meatball sandwiches into a profession? How did you decide this was something you wanted to pursue, writing about sports and covering the sport of baseball?
Well, I was I had an older brother who was a big sports fan, so we followed sports pretty closely in our house. We used to get the Pittsburgh Press, which was the afternoon newspaper in Pittsburgh, and we would fight over who would get the sports section first. And so I read the sports page every day as a kid. In fact, my earliest memories of reading were reading comics in the Pittsburgh Press. I think I was able to sound out words by reading the comic strips. But in any event, I read the sports section, and I really loved baseball, probably because it was the longest season. And I read every day's baseball stories. And I think after a while, going through school, I thought I became a pretty decent writer. And it came time to think about college and what I wanted to study. And I thought, well, I'm a decent writer and I love sports, so maybe I could be a sports writer. So that's, there was no great aha moment or anything like that. It was just, okay, I can write. And there are people that obviously make a living doing this, and so I majored in journalism in school and became a journalist.
So can you tell me about the first big game or first big moment you remember reporting on? Nervous? How did you feel? What did you feel like you might miss if you took your eyes off of the players, if you took your eyes off of the field? What was that like in the early days
Well,
for you as a reporter?
it's funny because I went to school at Point Park College for 2 years in Pittsburgh, and then I transferred to a school in San Francisco because I wanted to be in the Bay Area because there was so much sports there, college and professional sports. So I must have covered a couple of games. I know I covered a couple of games in college, but my first game covering as a professional journalist was at a small 3-time-a-week paper in Tracy, California. And it was the end of August, early September. It was really hot. This was in the Central Valley. It was like just amazingly hot there in the summers. And I remember going to the press box at the first football game at Tracy High School that year. And I sat down in the press box, and the game was getting ready to start. And I realized I had no idea how to cover a football game. I mean, literally no idea. And, there was an older guy sitting next to me who was there from the Stockton Record, actually. And he looked at me and he said, "You don't know what you're doing, do you?" And I said, "No." So he showed me how to set up kind of like a play-by-play grid and chart every play, first and 10, second and 6, what happens on each play. And so it took me about a quarter to kind of get used to it. And finally, by the end of that game, I felt like I almost knew what I was doing. But I'll tell you, at the outset, I realized I had no clue. So that was kind of a fun moment. And I had opportunities to cover some pretty great assignments as a sports writer. Got to cover the National League Championship Series with the Giants and Cardinals in 1987. Home and away. That was kind of fun. Got to cover the All-Star game in Oakland. I think that was in 1988. And so there were some fun assignments as a sports writer.
So for you covering those big games, playoffs, does it feel bigger in the moment? Does it feel faster? Does it feel slower? Is it different for you as a reporter?
Yeah, I never felt overwhelmed or intimidated by the moment. I was not, in 1987, I was in my early 30s, so I had had some experience, and I always felt good writing on deadline. And that's one of the things about sports is that makes it different from covering news. You're often writing on a very tight deadline, or at least you were back when I was doing it. So I never felt intimidated or panicked. I think it energized me, and that adrenaline sort of fueled me. So it was fun. It was fun to cover those assignments. You look at your watch and you realize you only have 20 minutes to write a story. You just write. You're not really thinking. And just a quick aside: in those days, we were using like prehistoric laptops. They were made by Radio Shack, and they were called TRS 80s, and we called them Trash 80s. And they had like a small. The screen was about this high, so you could see maybe like 2 lines of type as you were writing your story. So it was just incredibly hard. And then when you wanted to send your story, you had to find a payphone, and you had these rubber couplers that you would plug the phone into. So you always had to scout out like where you were going to send your story after the game. You had to find a payphone, and sometimes the phone wouldn't work. And so that was the hardest part of these assignments, was actually sending the stories. Things have come a long way in terms of technology. So.
I was going to say, I know friends now, even folks I've worked with at the Erie Reader, who have told me they're at a live event and they're writing a story on a smartphone. So it's crazy to see how fast things have gone. And I've got to imagine, being able to write a story in 20 minutes when it comes to in the classroom and students accepting something beyond a due date. There's not much room right to the deadline.
No, deadlines are so important. And I mean, there is no forgiveness there. And also just prior, one last thing on that, before we got these laptops that now I can, trash, we would have to dictate stories over the phone. So I can remember covering a high school football game and finding a payphone and having to dictate it to somebody at the office, and they would type it in as I was dictating. And you talk about a difficult assignment, off the top of your head dictating a story. It was brutal, not fun, not fun.
I'd be curious to see whether or not you still make students do that in the classroom today, but I want to get into the books. And
Sure.
so before we get to your newest book, let's revisit the last one. What drew you to the story of Willie Stargell, and why write about him? Why write his biography?
Well, it was actually pretty simple. My son and I took a trip to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. I think it was in 2006, I believe it was, the summer of 2006, maybe. And we went to there was a bookstore gift shop there, and I was looking around, and I realized there was no biography of Stargell. Now, he had written his autobiography, but it wasn't great. It wasn't bad, but it was not great. So there was a void, I guess, in the baseball canon when it came to Stargell. So I thought, well, maybe I could do this. I had summers off because I was teaching at Gannon. So the first thing I did was I emailed Steve Blass, who Pirate fans would recognize. He was a Pirate pitcher and a longtime broadcaster. I emailed him and asked him if he thought Stargell would make a good subject for a biography, because I wanted to make sure that Stargell was, a legitimate person and he wasn't a fake, so to speak, because you never know how people really are. They might have a public persona that's one way, and then, when the cameras are off, they might be jerks, to put it mildly. So I emailed Blass and asked him his opinion. He said, no, he's a great guy, and, certainly worthy of a biography treatment. So that's what got me onto the Stargell project. After I emailed Blass, I emailed Kevin McClatchy, who was just leaving as the owner of the Pirates, and he was kind enough to give me an interview and set me up with some names of some former teammates of Stargell, and that's kind of how the project got started.
So once you got the green light, what was next? For many of us who have not written a biography, not done that kind of research, once you got the green light, everybody seems to say, okay, he's not the fake, he's a real person, it's worth covering. Now let's dig in. What did that process look like for you?
Well, I had to find I wanted to find a publisher first before I wrote anything. So I belong to this organization called SABR, the Society for American Baseball Research, and they were having a conference or convention, whatever you want to call it, in Atlanta. I think it was, I can't remember what year it was. So one of my best friends lives in Atlanta, so I thought I'd go down and visit him and go to this conference. When I went to the conference, one of the things they had in this hotel was a room set aside for vendors to selling their books. So I walked up to this one guy who was with McFarland and Company Publishers and told him I had this idea. So he said, well, when you go home, write up a proposal. And so I did, and he approved it. And so that's, gave me the green light to really get going. So I had sketched out kind of a table of contents for him in the proposal. And, I basically went about it chronologically, from his birth to all the way through his life. So then I started trying to find people that knew him at different points in his life, childhood friends, family members, former teammates, opponents, things like that, all throughout his life. And I was able to find a lot of people on the internet through the use of these tools called like white pages and people search. I don't know if you've ever heard of these things. Now they're not, in the old days, they were wide open, they were free. Now you have to subscribe to them. But so I found a lot of people just that way, and would just call them up and ask if they would, had a few minutes, and if now wasn't a good time, could I call you back later? And just started accumulating these interviews, and it took about 6 or 7 years of, interviewing people and then ultimately writing the thing. So.
And it's a really great read, and I'm not just saying that as a former student, somebody who admires your work. It really is, and I want to encourage people, if they haven't already read it, to go and get it and give it a read. It's a great covering of his life and the importance of what he went through, how he played the game, and what others thought of him. So I don't want to give it all away, but Frank, what was one of the things that surprised you when you were doing the research that you either didn't know or just really gripped you in the moment when you came across that when it came to Willie Stargell?
Well, I grew up in Pittsburgh and watched Stargell. I was, 15 in 1970. So I had seen his career prior to that and then afterwards. And, to be honest, he wasn't my favorite player. There were players on that 70s Pirates team that I liked more. I've never been a huge fan of power hitters and strikeouts. I liked Al Oliver. I liked Manny Sanguillen. Those guys were, good hitters, not tremendous power. But anyway, so I thought, well, you hear so much about Stargell, and then later in his career when he, was with the 79 Pirates and We Are Family. And, I like I said, I just kind of wondered how much of that was real. And so I guess what I was struck by was just how everyone that I interviewed basically kind of had the same story and just about what a stand-up guy he was and not a fake. I mean, he told it like it was. I remember I asked somebody about, did you feel comfortable going to Stargell, to talk about things? And he said, yes, but he said, you always knew with Willie, he was going to give you a straight answer. So if you didn't want a straight answer, you shouldn't go to him, so he wasn't about, making people feel good. He was a straight shooter. And so to me, that's what stuck with me maybe the most was just how much integrity he had.
So Frank, of all the Pirates past, why did Arky Vaughan land on your list to research next and write about next?
Well, to be honest, after I finished the Stargell book, I thought about trying to write something on a guy named Dick Groat, who played for the Pirates in the 50s and 60s. And he's probably the most accomplished athlete ever to come out of Pittsburgh. A lot of people don't know that, but he was a college All-American basketball player at Duke in the early 50s. And he was also a college All-American baseball player at Duke. He signed with the Pirates right after his senior season ended at Duke and went directly to the big leagues, never played in the minor leagues. So I thought this would be a great story. So I contacted him, and he runs a golf course out near Ligonier. So I went out there one day and sat down and had my laptop and interviewed him. And then we were about 90 minutes into the conversation. He said, I was basically done with my questions and I didn't want to go on any longer. And I said, well, I really appreciate this. This is going to be great. I'm sure I'll have some more questions. Maybe we can set up another interview. He said, I don't think I want to do this. And I said, why not? He said, well, I just don't feel comfortable. So it was like, well, that was that. So then I started thinking about other Pirates Hall of Famers who hadn't had a book treatment. And I came upon Arky Vaughan, who actually, from the stories I was told as a boy, he was my dad's favorite player. When my dad was born in 1927, and Vaughan broke in with the Pirates in 1931 or 32, and played through 1941. So my dad passed away when I was 5 years old, so I never really got to talk to my dad about baseball much. But all my uncles had told me that he was a big fan of this Arky Vaughan, and that always stuck with me, that name, as a kid, just because it's kind of a funny name. So I started thinking, well, Hall of Famer, nobody's ever written about him. He was kind of a mysterious guy because he never said two words, and he died in a tragic boating accident when he was 40. So he wasn't around very long. Shortly after he retired, he had only been retired about 4 years before he passed away. So that's why I thought, well, I'll take a shot at this.
And so the process is vastly different. I have to imagine interviewing and being able to talk to people in Willie Stargell's orbit, and now trying to rewind it and go back much further. And so tell us a little bit about that research process, what that was like once you committed to say, okay, it's Arky Vaughan, I'm going at this and I'm going to do this. I have a new biography. How'd you get started? what was different in the process?
Very challenging, a lot more challenging. For one thing, I really, as a journalist, I love interviewing people. I mean, I love to hear people tell stories. I think I'm a pretty good interviewer and ask decent questions and things. I can get people to talk. So it was different. The first thing I did was try to find, are there any people still alive that might have played with him or, knew him? And I was able to come up with a few people, but I talked to a guy who was an usher at Forbes Field, his name's Phil Coyne. He's still alive. He's like 102 years old or something. But so I interviewed him, but he didn't really have much about Arky Vaughan. He talked a lot about, the old days at Forbes Field, but he remembered Vaughan, but he didn't have any real usable anecdotes. So then I went to his family, and I was able to get a hold of one of his grandchildren, and it was like the mother lode there because she had all the stuff that her mother was Arky's oldest daughter. So she had inherited all the stuff that her mother had collected over the years, scrapbooks, newspaper articles, photographs, just all of the stuff in boxes that, she had in a storage unit. And so I made contact with the granddaughter. Her name's Kate Roberts, and this is in California. And so she was very suspicious, why do you want to do this? I've had other people that wanted to do this and they never followed through. So I said, well, I'd like to do this, just give me a shot. So I went out and met with her in California, and she showed me all the materials that she had. And one of the things she had was her mother had tried to write a biography of Arky Vaughan, and it was there in paper form. It was hundreds of pages, and she tried to sell it and nobody bought it, and then she passed away. So the granddaughter Kate said, you can have this as reference. And so that was a huge help. And then the next thing that really that made this all possible, or a couple of things. One is this website called baseballreference.com, which is just a goldmine of statistics. And then there's this other, I don't know if you're familiar with a website called newspapers.com, but you subscribe to it and you can access a number of newspapers across the country. And it's like microfilm, if anybody remembers microfilm, except it's on your computer. So you can do a search on a person's name and a date or a date range and the newspaper name, and it'll pull up all the day's newspapers in which this person's name appeared. And then you click on it and it pops up on your screen, the actual newspaper, and you can clip articles. You draw a box around it and hit print, and you can email it to yourself. So I spent probably 2 summers, if not maybe 2 summers, just going chronologically from when he broke in as a player all the way through the end of his life, basically. And that took forever. And I just would print out, I had manila file folders by year and just print it out, throw it in there, print it out, throw it in there, knowing someday I'll write this,
So what, same question there that I asked with Willie Stargell, what surprised you or caught you off guard or just really moved you when you were researching?
Well, the thing about Vaughan was he was, had this reputation of being a silent guy. He did not talk, didn't like to be interviewed, which was true. He used to send his brother out after games because autograph seekers would hang around the players' exit gate at Forbes Field waiting to get players to get autographs. He'd send his brother out there sometimes because he just didn't like the limelight. He never, wanted to be honored. His hometown, he grew up in Fullerton, California. And after his rookie year, they wanted to have this, big thing. And, he eventually did it, but he wasn't comfortable in the spotlight at all. So, but what surprised me was one of the things that his daughter had saved were postcards that Arky had written to this family in Pittsburgh. They were friends of him and his wife, and so they would often spend time during the season, and then sometimes in the off season, this couple from Pittsburgh, Tom and Helen Smith, they would go to California and visit Arky and his wife. But anyway, he had written these postcards to the Smiths while he was driving from Pittsburgh to California after the season was over. This is 2 or 3 years worth of these postcards, and he had a great sense of humor. He had this really kind of dry, brief sense of humor, and it was just funny to see him in his own cursive writing these little jabs at Tom and Helen Smith. It was great. And I talked to their both the son and daughter of Tom and Helen Smith, and they both had memories of Arky staying with the family and things like that. So even though he had this public persona of being pretty quiet and not much to say, he actually had a personality, and you could see it in his own writing.
As you got closer to Arky Vaughan and unpacked stories about him, because he was your father's favorite player, did you feel like you got closer to your dad in this process?
Well, it's a great question. To be honest with you, I didn't think that much about it because, for one thing, all of his brothers, the guys that used to talk about that, they've all passed as well. So I never really got to talk to them as an adult about Arky Vaughan. So I just felt good about being able to write it, in case he can access it wherever he is up there. So, yeah, I don't know if it made me feel closer, but it certainly was in the back of my mind, I'm sure.
I'm sure he's smiling down. I'm sure he's thinking great about it. Do you have a set of rules that you follow when it comes to writing biographies? Do's and don'ts, places that you don't cut corners, you won't bend when you approach this? You talked about the file folders and a little bit of the process, but do you sit down with a sheet of rules in front of you and say, I've got to make sure I do this, and I check it off. I've got to do that, I check it off. What do you abide by?
Well, I am after the most accurate biography I can tell. So in the case of Willie Stargell, that meant a little bit of some uncomfortable areas. He had several children outside of his marriages, so and he was very supportive of all of his children, and all of his children treated each other as siblings, even though Willie wasn't married to their mothers. But I didn't hide any of that. I wanted to make sure that was told. And I guess maybe that's my only rule, is I want to tell the most complete story I can. I'm not going to sugarcoat or hide anything. And in some cases, I interviewed some people for the Stargell book, and my publisher requires me to get a signed letter from every source that says, they're participating in this project willingly and are not seeking any remuneration for their participation. So I had several people that I had interviewed for the Stargell book, and they were great interviews. And when I was drafting the book, I used the material, but they would not sign the sheet. I guess they had second thoughts. So some of that material never made it into the book. And one of them was one of his daughters, Dawn, D-A-W-N was her name. She was just a tremendous speaker. She was and had great memories of Willie, and a lot of good material that after I, sent the letter to her, she didn't want to sign, and I emailed her and I said, I'll send you the chapter that I wrote with your material in it, and you tell me if there's anything questionable, I'll take it out. She read it and emailed me back. She said, it's great. She said, I just don't feel comfortable being involved. And I said, okay. So as far as rules go, I really don't have any. I just want to be as complete as possible.
One of the important roles I think sports plays is it helps us with social issues and issues of the moment, issues of the now as we go through that. And today we can't help but see that role that sports is playing on social issues, from players kneeling during the United States anthem to fellow NASCAR drivers pushing the car of Bubba Watson in solidarity to show their support in the 60s and 70s for Stargell, and then the 30s and the 40s for Vaughan. differences and similarities on social issues that existed for each player and how you wanted to make sure you worked with that during the time you were writing and researching them.
Yeah, I'll take the Stargell book first. He was born in Oklahoma, but he grew up in Northern California in the Bay Area near Oakland, a place called Alameda. And it was a melting pot. Every race was there. So Stargell grew up with, white friends, Asian friends, African-American friends, and he never really experienced any sort of discrimination or prejudice. And then when he signed with the Pirates, he ran into that in the minor leagues and at spring training. In his early years with the Pirates, they had segregated quarters for the black athletes that were in spring training. He heard things in the stands in some of the towns that he played in. So that was new to him. I remember one of the things that I really wanted to do was talk to his minor league teammates as opposed to, as well as his teammates with the Pirates, because they went way back. I think he signed in 58 or somewhere around there. So, and I remember an anecdote that one of his teammates told me about how they were taking a road trip on a bus and going into this town in Southwest Texas that was segregated, and all the players got off the bus and went into a restaurant, and he had to stay on the bus, and somebody brought his food out for him, and he was crushed. He was crying, and this teammate said it hurt him so much to see Willie in pain like that, because he was a great young kid, and didn't deserve it, obviously. So race was an issue there. One of the things that came up in the book, in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and there was several teams, including the Pirates, who did not. This was right near the start of the baseball season. It was early April, and so the Pirates were scheduled to play a game against Houston to start the season, and Stargell and some of the other African American players on the Pirates said they wouldn't play, and so ultimately the Astros postponed the game for a couple of days and picked it up later. But so Willie obviously was very enlightened in issues relating to race. He became a third base coach for the Atlanta Braves, and some of the things I read said that he was among the first black third base coaches in the major leagues. He talked about maybe managing someday, never had that opportunity. But so race kind of made its way through the Stargell book. For Arky Vaughan, race wasn't that big of a deal, although he did play on the 1947 Brooklyn Dodgers, which was the team that integrated baseball with Jackie Robinson. But I couldn't find anything where he was interviewed about Robinson and what he felt about it. It was pretty controversial, as you can imagine. During spring training, Robinson was in spring training with the Dodgers, but he was actually property of their AAA minor league team, and there was a lot of questions: is Robinson going to make the Dodgers? And some players were very outspoken about not wanting to play with a black player. But after Arky Vaughan died, the day after his death, there were newspaper stories, and Jackie Robinson was quoted as saying, something along the lines of, he was a friend when I needed one, So I think I could imagine Arky being a kind of like a calming influence, because he was a very steady person. Another thing that came up in the Vaughan book was the whole idea that his career was basically played either during, the Great Depression or World War II. So those were social things that I tried to examine a little bit. I actually have one chapter in the book devoted to the Depression and how it affected the city of Pittsburgh and people who lived there. So that was kind of one way I tried to illustrate, well, this was going on while Vaughan was playing. And then in Vaughan's, toward the end of his career, he actually sat out 3 seasons, 1944, 45, and 46, because he ran a cattle ranch in California, and there were no available men to run the ranch because they were all in the service. So he stayed away from baseball for 3 years, and he was still a viable player, and then came back after the war and played 2 more years. But so he was impacted by the war, indirectly. He didn't serve. He had a deferment because he had a ranch. But that did come up.
Tell us a little bit about the impact of baseball on Pittsburgh during the Great Depression, what it was like to play through such a moment in history.
Well, I think, like many cities, the attendance dipped markedly, for one thing. People weren't going out to the games. As I was doing research, through those years, there would be little stories in the papers about, sort of like free entrance today for, this sort of segment of Pittsburgh, or this group of, laid off workers could get into a game for free. So I think baseball kind of gave people something to look forward to. It was sort of a diversion, because for many people it was very, very tough times. I interviewed this one woman who, was a young girl during the Depression, and the stories that she had were just amazing. Things like, going to a department store with her mother and having her mother steal her a pair of shoes and running out the store, and going down to the in the strip district trying to find damaged canned goods that were thrown off these box cars. And it just really enveloped people's lives, and it makes you wonder what it would have been like to go through that yourself. But so the Depression was there as a backdrop. I didn't get into too much about it in terms of how it affected players and things like that. That a lot of them still earned a good salary, although many players had their salaries cut. Like the biggest stars of the game had major salary reductions.
And you mentioned Vaughn walks away from the sport to go tend to his ranch, and then comes back to the sport. And I think viewers at home might wonder the economic impact of doing something like that today. Of walking away from a multi-million-dollar sports contract to go work at home because you have to. Versus doing that back then. But you mentioned World War II, and I don't want to gloss over Vietnam War as well, the impact, and comparing that on sports as well. Can you give us some insight on the Vietnam War's impact?
Well, one of the things that Stargell did was he took a trip to Vietnam during one of the off seasons. I can't remember what year it was. They used to do that, where they would bring a handful of players and bring them over to kind of meet with the troops, and just sort of as a morale booster. And so I was able to get a hold of one of the guys that went on that trip with him was a player for the Baltimore Orioles named Merv Rettenmund, and I was able to interview him. And he just talked about how Stargell was the biggest star, so to speak, in the group. So wherever he went, through these hospitals, seeing soldiers who were recovering from war injuries and things, people's eyes would light up when they would see Stargell. And the locals, the Vietnamese people, would call him Boo Coo Man, which meant like he was big. He was sort of like larger than life. But and it's been a while since I looked at the book, but Rettenmund had some interesting recollections of that trip. And just, one of the things I remember him saying was they told the players never ask somebody how they were feeling, because it was obvious, they were there with a, amputated limb or whatever. So they just tried to talk and cheer them up as best they could.
So before I get to the big news that you've got the book in hand, you've got the cover, I do want to fact check myself. I think I had a slip of the tongue when I said Bubba Watson. Well, of course, I meant Bubba Wallace when I'm talking about the NASCAR drivers. So fact checking myself there. But Frank, you've got the book in your hands for Arky Vaughan. It just showed up. Let's see the cover. So tell us what it feels like. You've authored a book. It shows up. It's in your hands. What's that feeling like for you as an author, a biographer?
Well, it's a relief because just the whole process is, it's so lengthy, especially because I teach. So once the school year starts, I do not touch these book projects. I just do not have any time. So I work on them all summer and put them away at the end of summer. And then when May comes around, I pull material out again. So this past May, the book was just about done. I was actually editing the chapters, and a fellow in Erie by the name of Eric Compton, who is a part-time copy editor at the Erie Times News. I used to work with him in sports when I worked there part-time. He's a great copy editor. So I asked him if he would mind reading the chapters. He had done that for my Stargell book. So I sent him the chapter by chapter, and he would read it and send me back, some things that needed changed. So I submitted the chapters, waited to hear from the publisher. The last thing that they have you do is compile an index as well as read the galleys, the pages. So compiling an index is no fun. It's mind-numbing, and nobody wants to do it because you just want to be done with the thing by this point. So when it arrives in an actual book form in a box as it did today, there's a feeling of satisfaction, but mostly it's just relief. And then you have to start thinking about, well, what can I do to, help market the book? The publisher wants names of people who might be interested in reviewing the book and things like that. So there is a sort of a shift from the time the book arrives, then you sort of go into a different mode. And I'm not much of a salesman. I have a hard time, promoting the book. I just don't feel comfortable doing it. But I'm happy that it's done. It's not exactly what I would have wanted just because of licensing limitations and things like that, and length. The publisher, gives you a certain word count that you have to try to adhere to. So, you can always write more, but they cut you off basically.
So licensing and issues, talk to us about the challenge of working in art into the book and some of the limitations and challenges you ran into.
Yeah, I had the publisher that I work with, McFarlane and Company. They like you to provide some art, some photos for the book. So I was in touch with some family members. The Vaughan family members had some photos. Collectors, I ran into a collector. It's interesting. There are just these random Arky Vaughan fanatics out there, and they collect things. I mean, they have old uniforms and programs and all kinds of stuff, bats and things. But anyway, so I found a guy who had like hundreds of photos that were from wire services and newspapers back in the 30s and 40s. So he was kind enough to let me have them. But the problem was, even though he owned the photo, the 8x10 glossy, he didn't own the rights to them. So Getty Images owned a lot of rights to old photos, and I got in touch with them. The cost was prohibitive to use those photos, so I had to go to a plan B and use a little more family photos. And then the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, they also had some photos that I was able to use for a much more affordable licensing fee. And the Pittsburgh Pirates actually had some photos that I was able to use as well. They allowed me to use those for free. So working with those three sources, I was able to get enough for the book. Another thing where licensing came up was just even in newspaper articles. The New York Times wanted to charge a certain amount for use of old newspaper, excerpts from old newspaper articles, which I didn't run into with the Stargell book. So I wasn't able to use a lot of New York Times stuff. I had to find other newspapers. Luckily, there was a newspaper in Brooklyn when he was playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers that I was able to use. It's now defunct, so I didn't have to worry about getting permission to use that material. So anyway, there are licensing issues. There are length limitations. It never turns out exactly the way you want, but I'm proud of the way it came out.
Let's say, regardless of the limitations and the challenges, congratulations on the relief. You've got it. Now it's phase 2 or 3, whatever the phase number is, to marketing and pushing it out. As we're moving toward the end here, Frank, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, years of covering sports, your thoughts on the 2020 season. No fans in the stands, shortened schedule, already cancellation of games with a COVID-19 outbreak happening with the Miami Marlins. Where are we today with baseball amidst a pandemic?
Well, I'm a pretty optimistic person, and in the weeks leading up to the start of the season, I was pretty convinced that it wasn't going to happen. And so I'm glad that it happened, but I'm such a big believer in the long haul when it comes to baseball. You know, it's 162 games. You know, the numbers to me are all based on that kind of a season, not that length of a season. So the idea of a 60-game season, you know, it doesn't sit well with me. But, you know, I was there Monday night watching the home opener, and, you know, every pitch, never missed a pitch. And so I imagine I'll, you know, watch baseball. At first I thought it would be hard with nobody in the stands, but when you're focusing on the actual game itself, and especially at PNC Park, sometimes late in the season, there aren't many fans there anyway. So it wasn't that bad, and it's not bad on the radio. I don't know if you've listened, but they have this sort of low hum of a crowd noise that plays in the background, and it kind of works on radio. It may not work as well on TV, but I think it's good that they're playing. I don't know how much longer they're going to play. You know, we saw what happened to the Miami Marlins. I just don't know that there's, you know, anything we can do to prevent that from occurring in more than one place. So I'm just trying to enjoy it while it's here and make the best of it.
So we'll hold on to our hats, we'll hold on to our gloves, and we are going to hope for the best. I'm with you on that, Frank. So some quick hits on the door on the way out. Yes or no, easy one-liner answers. Maybe not easy depending on the question. We'll see. But you've covered both. So in general, what's tougher to cover, news or sports?
News is tougher. Sports was like a second nature to me, so I found it a lot easier to cover than news.
Major League Baseball should do away with the designated hitter once and for all, yes or no?
I'm a purist at heart, but I don't like to watch pitchers hit. I'm okay with the designated hitter.
Favorite mark of punctuation?
The dash. I love dashes.
You and me both. Favorite sports bio written by someone not named Frank Garland?
The bio of Roberto Clemente, David Marinus wrote. I think that was an exceptional biography.
If you had to write bios of players not in baseball, what other sport are you picking? And you had to do that the rest of your career. You could never touch another sport. Which one are you switching to?
Well, that is a very tough question. The biography that I'd really love to write is that of Jack Lambert, the Steeler linebacker, who is sort of like a cult figure. And he's been featured in books, but nobody's ever really written a complete biography of him. That would be the one I'd like to write, and I'm sure it would take the rest of my life.
All right, peanuts or Cracker Jacks?
Cracker Jacks.
Hot dog or nachos?
Hot dogs, as long as they're grilled and not boiled.
Best Major League Baseball mascot?
It doesn't exist anymore. The San Diego Chicken was the first real mascot that I was aware of. Mid 70s, I actually got to interview him for a story when I was working in California while he had his costume on. So it was lots of fun.
I think there's a book in the making on that one. As a professor, advisor, toughest assignment you've ever given students?
Nothing comes to mind immediately. I think the assignment that students dislike the most is in my feature writing class the last few years. I've had them ride an EMTA bus and just write about it. What did you observe? And I've had many students come back and say it was like the worst experience of their life to ride a city bus. And it's like, come on, it's just riding a bus. They've obviously lived fairly sheltered lives. So for some reason, that's the assignment that I've had the most flack about.
I would challenge any of your students to take a bus ride with a former Erie Times News reporter as well, now writer for the Erie Reader, Liz Allen, who covers a lot of great stories like that. Maybe that would change their perspective. One last one. As a reporter writer, what's been the best assignment, single best assignment you've ever received from one of your editors?
Well, it's so hard to narrow it to one. Like I mentioned, covering the NLCS in 1987 was a great opportunity. Probably the single story that I enjoyed the most was I did a story on an old San Francisco 49er defensive back named Hardy Brown. And if you ever get some time, Google him. He was like reputed to be the toughest player pound for pound who ever played in the National Football League. He was not a big guy, but he had this shoulder tackle where he would come up from his position in the secondary and like lift his shoulder into people and literally knock them out. He knocked people out, like if not every game, almost every game. And so my assignment was to interview this guy. He was in, and I found him. He was in a rest home, and he was suffering from dementia. But I was able to talk to him a little bit, and obviously talk to people that he played with and his family and things. And that was one of the stories I was most proud of writing. It was pretty heart wrenching.
So, Frank, the last question I wanted to ask, I think you've already answered it, was who's next? What comes next in the Frank Garland biography canon? You said Jack Lambert. Is there a project that you do have in the works? Something else that you're exploring? Another pirate great that you're taking a look at?
I'm going back to Dick Groat. He's now 90 years old, and I've been in contact with his daughters. They would love for him to sit down with me and to let me tell his story, but he is still hesitant to do it. But I've spent this entire summer researching it. I'm just using the same process year by year, going through newspapers.com. I've interviewed some of his teammates and things. So I'm going to wear him down eventually, and that'll be my next project, I hope.
You let us know what we can do to be on Team Garland to make that happen. We're excited for it. But Mr. Frank Garland, the author of the biography of Arky Vaughan, as well as Willie Stargell, an assistant professor and journalism communications program director at Gannon University. Thank you for taking the time for joining us for this program today.
I appreciate the opportunity, Ben. Always good talking with you.
And thanks to all of you watching along at home, either live broadcast or watching a later broadcast of this event. Frank, for those looking to connect with you, follow along the work that you're doing, get copies of your book, plug into other things that you're writing. Where should we point those folks?
Well, the Vaughan book is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. If you just Google Arky Vaughan and my name, Frank Garland, you should be able to find it. It's also on the McFarland and Company website. You can order it directly there. I do a little writing still on the side for actually a Pirates website called Buck's Dugout. I use an assumed name because my son happens to work for the Pirates, and he has the same name I do, so it would be a little uncomfortable. I won't tell you what my assumed name is. You'll have to guess. But anyway, I still do a little writing there, so if you're interested in checking that out, that's bucksdugout.com.
Fantastic. And Frank, it's got to be a special thing to share a love of sports with your son, and now the fact that he works for the Pirates, right?
Oh yeah, he grew up a huge baseball fan. We were in California at the time. He grew up a major San Francisco Giants fan. So, but now he's gotten an opportunity to work in Major League Baseball, and I'm not sure how long he's going to do it, but he's enjoyed the 3 years that he's been there.
Fantastic. Frank, we appreciate it. We'll put all of that information in the comment section below. And of course, for more information on both past and upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs, as well as publications, please visit our website, jeserie.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.